Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for coming for the Creatures and Friends seminar. I think this is our 9th seminar in the series. So some of you maybe know that it's a series of monthly events where the Creatures Project, which stands for Creative Practices for Transformational Futures, invite people who are doing creative practitioners or researchers who are doing interesting work in the area of eco-social transformation to share their experiences and some insights from their work with us and with you. And today at the 9th seminar, we have Laura Pereira as a guest, who will be talking about her work on the IPBES project, which stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I believe also about the Nature Futures framework that they are developing. I will give the floor to Laura, I guess. And thank you so much for joining us, Laura, today and making the time for us.
Great, thanks, Brigitte, and nice to meet all of you and to see some of the Creatures team. I've been following a lot of your work, so it'd be really nice to be able to engage with you on this. So what I've done is I sort of used a brief introduction to the work that we're doing as part of the IPBES task force on scenarios and models. So I'll sort of go through the initial bits just quite quickly. It was mainly explained in the link to the paper that was sent in as preparatory sort of reading for the seminar, and then hopefully get onto some of the more interesting bits around the narratives and sort of storytelling and pathways approaches that we're going to be using. And we'll hopefully have lots of time for question and engagement. So I am going to start now by sharing screen, and hopefully it is sharing the correct one. Is it sharing the correct one? Okay, yes, no. Can you?
Oh, actually, not really. You should do the swap. Yeah.
The swap again.
Oh, Lord. Yeah.
Yes.
That's better now.
Yeah. That's it.
Literally every time I do it, I have to swap the screen again. It's completely bizarre. Anyhow, technology, fantastic. So, operationalizing the Nature Futures framework from the IPBES Scenarios and Models Task Force. In essence, just firstly to thank the task force for the use of the slides. As you can see, I've got the IPBES logo over everything. So this is obviously not an official IPBES presentation, but it does draw a lot on their work. So just to acknowledge that and to give credit to the whole task force as a collective leading on this work. So sort of really briefly going to talk about why IPBES needs new scenarios, the process of going about developing the Nature Futures framework, and then some of the operationalization that I've been involved in, which is this idea of illustrative scenarios, and hopefully have some time to link to the Twine Choose Your Own Adventure sort of pathway discussion at the end. So to jump right in, 2016, there was a methodological assessment report from IPBES on scenarios and models for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in essence, the main findings was that there are scenarios available. They're useful tools for policy support, but most of the global ones are actually just limited to assessing the impact of different drivers of change on sort of BES as biodiversity and ecosystem services. So they're not actually putting nature at the center. There are very few that actually focus on sort of normative or desirable futures. Most of the global scenarios used in the kind of environmental sphere developed for other purposes, such as climate change, using the social shared socioeconomic pathways, the SSPs, or the representative concentration pathways. And sort of within this, that means that most of these global scenarios actually lack a participatory approach, or something that actually looks at plural values or perspectives. And that is really difficult to sort of represent different or transformative responses and their associated implications in this. And so this was sort of setting up the need for a new generation of scenarios for this community. Coming out of the global assessment report, which was published in 2019, sort of an added gap was recognized that the current scenarios are not actually providing diverse multicultural options that really engage society in how we can, what is called bend the biodiversity curve. So sort of address the the deep sort of biodiversity loss and sort of degradation in nature that we're currently on. And in particular, they lack an explicit consideration of Indigenous peoples and local communities and their knowledge and understanding of regions. So that was another big gap that we sought to try and address through this process. So what we did is we went through a whole lot of different phases, and don't worry yourself with actually understanding what's going on here, but in essence, you can see that there were a few phases that also engage with sort of stakeholders to kind of refine the, my screen sharing is paused. Okay, well, someone yell if it stops at some point. Zoom is sending strange messages to me.
Yeah, it's not working.
Actually, it's, yeah, it seems that you're still stuck on the first slide.
Right, it said it's paused. I don't know why it was paused.
Let's try again.
Sorry, guys, if you could yell and tell me this, because I can't actually see if that happened. That would be very helpful. Yeah, no.
Yeah, now we are at a different slide. I don't know how many did we actually skip though. So
you've skipped 5. So
all right.
Ideals. Okay. This is why you need to do 20 minutes of presentation for actual 30 minutes. Okay, so is it sharing correctly, or do I need to swap displays again?
No, it's okay.
All right.
The view is okay.
So this is what you missed out on.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm doing in the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Why we need new scenarios. Why IPBES needs new scenarios. And then sort of the process that we went through to elaborate on actually developing this nature futures framework. So we started with the visioning process in Auckland in 2017 with a sort of really diverse group of stakeholders, went back into a variety of different engagements, the IPBES 6 plenary, as well as the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in 2018, elaborated on the vision. So sort of is a very iterative process is basically what this is trying to illustrate. And eventually we landed up sort of moving from these visions into the Nature Futures framework. But this is, I realize, actually a very low res version of this image. Sorry for that. I will improve that next time. But what happened in the New Zealand meeting is that we landed using the seeds approach, which is a sort of very bottom-up way of sort of thinking about more desirable futures, with 7 visions of potentially desirable future states for nature that focused on different aspects. So some was on water, some was on urban rural flow, some looking kind of at the dynamics of nature and working with that, and a variety of sort of different thematic areas that people thought were important to incorporate in these visions. And from that, we sort of mapped these together into what we've decided to call the Nature Futures framework, which is in essence this triangle that you see on the right-hand side. And we're still playing around a little bit what the final image actually looks like. But what you can see is that it kind of maps 3 different value perspectives for nature that can all be seen to be positive. So nature for nature sort of values sort of the intrinsic value of nature, sort of nature existing for itself, sort of not just with for the benefit of humans. The right-hand corner, you have nature for society, which focuses a lot on this idea of nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services. So what we derive from nature, sort of food and shelter and all those kinds of things. And then the left-hand side is sort of really looking at nature as culture. So not being able to see humans as separate from nature, sort of this idea of living as one with nature and all the different values that sort of more relational component relational value component actually has. So this is sort of where we went from this visioning process, which is very broad, into the sort of framework that we're trying to use to galvanize more diverse scenarios of human nature relationships. And so here you can see it a little bit more clearly. The whole sort of main point behind this framework is that you're able to hold a plurality of sort of multiple value perspectives, that there's no sort of one point within the triangle that's any better than any other point, and that we also recognize that in different circumstances and different times, different people will hold or emphasize different sort of value perspectives over others. The nice thing about this is that it also maps quite clearly onto the IPBES conceptual idea of what values actually mean. So again, this idea of intrinsic values of nature, instrumental values of nature, the nature of the society side, and relational values for nature, which was sort of published by Unai Pascual and colleagues in 2017. And there's an ongoing assessment report actually looking at diverse values for nature that we hope this can contribute a lot to from a futures thinking perspective. So within the sort of, there are two main points that I wanted to emphasize with this idea of the framework. And the first is that the triangle is a relative space that sort of tries to capture a plurality of possible combinations of desirable futures. So the real emphasis here is that we don't just have one or two or three sort of different ideas, but that there really is a multitude of potentially desirable futures sort of fitting within the space. But there's a really interesting normative challenge that kind of to define what is inside the circle, the triangle versus what is outside. So what are the kind of extreme edges of these values outside of which we're no longer actually sitting on a desirable pathway for nature? And that's sort of a really interesting question that we're grappling with at the moment. You know, science can tell us so much about the fact that we're on a very bad trajectory at the moment, but sort of defining what that normative or good or desirable component is, even understanding plurality is going to be an ongoing challenge, I think for us going forward. But this is hopefully where some of the pathways work will be able to help us navigate that. So what we did is to operationalize this. There's a variety of other complementary processes that are happening in terms of looking at models and looking at indicators and social ecological feedbacks within the triangle. But I sort of wanted to present to you sort of probably the most the work that's progressed the most, which is trying to develop 6 sort of illustrative narratives that can kind of illustrate what these different corners and sort of the in-between parts of the vertices can actually tell us about what some of these features might look like. And this we went through a really interesting sort of process to try and explain what those are. I'm going to sort of briefly present them. So the starting points when we went into trying to design or trying to develop these illustrative narratives was that, you know, we went through a participatory process to start off with, but then it was sort of very much expert-led at this point because we needed to sort of really hone in on a specific set of narratives we could then feed back and then hopefully galvanize the community to come up with sort of future ones, which is why we're calling them illustrative. They're not sort of like the SSPs where they're the given storylines. They're just an example of what storylines could look like if you were to use the framework. They need to be sort of multi-scale. They need to operate as well at the global level as within different places. And sort of that cross-scale compatibility really has been a challenge, and I think is going to be the main challenge for the modeling going forward. Again, this idea of sort of the extreme corners, like what is still desirable within the space, recognizing that there's a plurality of what we perceive of as being desirable. And so capturing that plurality and diversity, as well as this idea of a transformed future, like sort of something that's fundamentally different from what we're seeing now, sort of not just a linear projection, was kind of the main starting points that we were thinking about when we were developing these narratives. So just to quickly hop on this idea of transformative change, if anyone's been following the IPBES discussions or sort of biodiversity and conservation science in general, there's been a lot of attention following the 2019 assessment on this idea of we need transformative change if we're actually going to get on a better trajectory. So what that exactly means is still up for debate, but in essence, what we wanted to try and capture is some of the sort of what the literature says as possible transformative solutions for sustainable futures. So whether that's from a governance perspective, where you've got a variety of different options, economics, everything from degrowth, post-growth, through to Green New Deals or sort of solidarity economies, different ideas on sort of how we need to sort of use land and sea, whether we want to spare land, share land, a half earth idea, rewilding, different even ideas around food production. So sustainable intensification, which sort of is very complementary to the land sparing idea, through to more agroecological ideas, which is sort of closer to land sharing. We wanted to be able to capture some of these debates and discussions in the different scenarios, or the scenario narratives. So what we did is we came up with 6 different sort of storylines mapped at the spot, these places within the triangle. And the reason there's 5 missing is that 5 was initially in the middle, but then we realized that was actually a really difficult space to sort of try and capture everything. So we actually just stuck with mapping out the edges. And what's interesting here is just to sort of recall that the triangle isn't of itself kind of relative. And so sort of if you look at nature for nature, nature for society, 1 and 2, like 7 is going to be kind of the middle of the road between them, and then the polar opposite of 7 should be 3, right? So sort of you're looking at, the closer you move away from 3, you're moving towards either 2 or 1 kind of idea. So hopefully that'll be a little bit clearer. We're working on how to communicate what's been a really long process of actually coming to terms with what this means. And I'll sort of explain briefly what some of these sort of storylines inside mean. So the narratives themselves, so sort of a position 1, the nature for nature, we had this idea of an arcology. We sort of gave a 2-line summary and some key words. So that is sort of the sort of very land sparing, sort of almost 70% of the planet has been set aside for nature. And so with that comes this idea of high urbanization, high technology, this idea of pristine wilderness that really does keep people off the land. So people live in dense, self-sustaining urban areas designed to minimize the role of or the impact of humans in the biosphere. And that is sort of opposite from position 4, which is sort of directly down at the bottom of the triangle, which is about people living in interconnected green, blue cities and rural settlements. There's much sort of stronger emphasis on local and traditional knowledge and actually access to nature rather than keeping people sort of off nature. Their mosaic landscapes and sort of land sharing is kind of a little bit more of the emphasis of that. And so we also sort of gave some brief discussions around sort of like what some of these deeper sort of literature discussions around sort of half earth versus whole earth approaches, and we can talk more about that in the discussion. But I thought, considering we're working with a sort of much more creative group, what actually sort of something to emphasize is that we were trying to visualize what these stories could actually look like. And so sort of really quickly during the workshop, just mocked up some of these ideas. And I think that, working with going beyond just the words, but actually getting some visual and sort of embodied representations of what these futures could look like really is an important next step. But hopefully this gives you a little bit more of a sense of what the ecology, number 1, the nature for nature one looks like, sort of wild, pristine, open areas with a lot of kind of dense urban dwellings where humans are. The next one at 7 down, sort of heading towards the nature for society. So between nature for nature, nature for society is sharing through sparing, which is also a lot of sort of pristine open land, but also this understanding that we need to use a little bit more of that for production. Optimizing nature is really about, we have these really diverse landscapes where we're really optimizing sort of what nature's services or contributions to people really can be. The innovative commons is sort of heading also more towards this relational value perspective for nature, where we're actually sort of recognizing sort of humans not just as separate from nature, but also sort of putting aside for example, areas for megafauna conservation and tourism, because people still feel the need to sort of generate sort of economic goods from nature. The far corner, this is the purely sort of reciprocal stewardship for nature idea, where there was drawing a lot of traditional ecological knowledge and relationship with nature. This is my favorite one, dynamic natures, where actually we're no longer sort of living in static areas, but sort of moving with the flow of nature, whether it's rivers or migrations or aspects of that, which I thought was pretty cool. Living on water, why not? so the interesting thing is to contrast those sort of rich ideas and conceptions of different futures with what is currently taken as the main sustainability scenario that we have within environmental scenario world, which is the shared socioeconomic pathway 1, sustainability, which is called taking the green road, which sort of talks about a gradual rather than a transformative shift, emphasizes inclusive development, talks about a global commons, sort of talks about a shift from economic growth to an emphasis on human well-being, but doesn't really give us the specific mechanisms for that. And there's also talk about reduced inequalities. So, but it's sort of a very kind of bland description that we've actually, I think, given a lot more meat to on these illustrative scenarios. So in terms of next steps, just looking at the time, and I think we're good. What we're trying to do as a group is to finalize these narratives so that they have sufficient detail, and we're almost done with that. And I think together with that could be some kind of a more arts-based approach to actually sort of really get a sense or a feeling of what these kinds of futures could be. They're also contested. It's been a really interesting process, and we can also talk about that more in the Q&A of how you actually bring an entire, just the task force on board in these kinds of stories, which are really quite radical for a lot of people, to actually sort of show them that this is still a useful exercise, even if we're probably not going to land up in that particular future, which I think is quite an interesting process that we can talk through a little bit more. Also developing pathways, so not just thinking about what the futures look like, but also how to get there, and in particular emphasizing 2050 as a stepping stone, because that's an important milestone for the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's also the need to relate to models, to sort of look at quantifying some of the drivers and responses, and also the impact on biodiversity and nature contributions to people in these different futures. Work that I've been involved in that I'm also happy to talk about a little bit more is we've done some specific case studies at different kind of regional sort of levels. So we've got one in the Hollandse Denen in the Netherlands, sort of very small local level case study that used the NFF. We did a process in Brazil 2 years ago, which was sort of really trying to engage youth leaders in conservation and biodiversity areas to sort of talk about what their futures could look like. And then I'm just sort of currently working with a colleague at Stockholm Resilience Center, Guillermo Otoño Crespo, on sort of trying to come up with some interesting scenarios and narratives for the high seas in the lead up to a negotiation on the BBNJ that I think is being postponed until January next year. So yeah, these are some of the case studies, and we really are encouraging as many people as possible to try and operationalize or use the NFF in whichever sort of case studies they're involved in. The next work is on the pathway, so sort of getting from where we are now, sort of a very small use of the triangle that doesn't really emphasize all of the different value perspectives that we have for nature, into a much more diverse, sort of bright set of understanding what these multiple value perspectives for nature could actually look like and how to get there. Part of the work that we've done is sort of using the 3 horizons framework, where you, I think a lot of you might be familiar, where you talk about sort of breaking away from the first horizon or the current system to build up into a much more transformed sort of 3rd horizon or future visioning. And through that, recognizing that, you don't just have one pathway towards that future, but there are many different bifurcations and different sort of roads that you could take towards that. And that in essence, that the sort of talks now about sort of decisions in the present, coming back to all of Joost's work on anticipatory governance, about how we're using the future to make better decisions now, to really talk about how do we make that transformative break into sort of a more nature futures framework inspired way of thinking about biodiversity futures. So what I wanted to share with you quickly is this sort of choose your own adventure twine story that we pulled together to sort of try and see if there was some interesting pathways to get to the different narratives. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I'm going to see if I can bring that one up. But I am going to need you guys to sort of talk to me as we do this. So please feel free to engage. And I now have the chat up. So yes, Eva, the slides should have been changing, and I hope they are changing now. I'm going to just quickly shut this down in the show and open up my Chrome and see if this will work if I share this screen. Okay, let's see if this is less problematic than the last one. Cool. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if hot corners is great up to a point. But it's giving this edit debug thing at the bottom. Sorry guys, I was playing around with the coding earlier, and you're probably just gonna have to ignore that at the bottom that there are no issues. Sorry. Trying to do this. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right, it's the year 2021 and you get to choose your best nature futures. So are you excited to explore the triangle, or are you getting back on your spaceship?
Explore the triangle.
Yay. That's the correct answer. Cool. Okay, so in this world, you either have high levels of urbanization, which have left vast tracts of rural areas uninhabited, or rural development programs have been successful in limiting the growth of cities and people are returning to the land.
High levels of urbanization.
High levels of urbanization. Great. Okay. There's now 2030. We're continuing to face high levels of biodiversity loss, and the world needs to come up with a solution. So how do we designate areas to protect, to conserve nature? We need limited protected areas to help preserve nature, but people still need to be able to sort of access their naturescapes. Or we need space for nature, and we have to severely limit access to natural areas.
Severely limit.
There we go. All right. Okay, we're still not quite there yet, guys, but it's 2150 and human society has reached a milestone. The first successful asteroid mining has gone into production, and we can grow our own tech industry without exploiting Earth's natural resources. But being so disconnected from the land has had an impact on our food systems. So it's okay, we've survived with highly intensive, super efficient urban agri-aquaculture and lab meat for the win. But we still need to use our land and seas for some food production, and we're relaxing our protective area coverage from 75 to 50% to allow us to maintain essential ecosystems while still sort of growing some crops. Or hold on, we completely rely on living with nature and I don't know why this is here, but we don't need to keep people off the land to protect it. So which of those three options? Lab meat, use our land, or put the people back on the land?
Put the people back in the land?
Back in the land. Okay, so we're going back now. All right. So our tech advances have meant that civilization has taken different directions in how we govern ourselves. So we've either returned to highly self-sufficient settlements based on our cultural heritage, or we've been learning from our nomadic ancestors and making use of our tech advances to sort of flow and be mobile with the dynamics of a changing nature. Or we've realized that there are livelihood opportunities in protecting nature to a certain extent by using our traditional knowledge and ways of production. You can also keep iconic species safe in this choice. And I really don't know why that is debugging at the bottom. Sorry, I wasn't doing that before.
We should flow and be mobile.
Flow and be mobile. My favorite one, yay. So you'll end up in dynamic natures. So sort of, this was really a quick mock-up that we did of sort of the kinds of key bifurcation points or decisions that you might be able to come up with as sort of development pathways. And as you can see here, I'm like really taken with the software when it doesn't sort of come up with bugs. So you can sort of see how you can cross back and sort of change direction based on things and sort of shift around. And these are really interesting kind of pathways that I think you could build into a much more creative sort of fashion than just kind of drawing a line up to the top right-hand corner. So yeah, that was pretty much the presentation, and it is within the half an hour. So, oh, sorry, Ludwig, option 2. I didn't see the chat when I was sharing, but we can always go back and play it if no one's got any questions again. Cool.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laura, and thanks for the game or the scenario walkthrough. And yeah, please, everyone, feel free to ask your questions, or if you have some comments, notes, any ideas to share. Eva, are you raising your hand? I think you are.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I'm very fascinated by your ability to pull very different things together. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to share, I don't know how to put this into question, but I try now in a very small time. So I got this sense of, I'm thinking of the people that I work with my ethnography. And I was lost with them sort of when I was listening to this scenario work. And by this, I mean that perhaps the question would be then that how do we connect local communities with this type of scenario work? And you already mentioned that this was with the expert and so forth, but like thinking of the power relations and yes, all of these things, what they actually mean for people's lives and livelihoods. Thank you.
Sure. So I mean, so just to sort of go back a bit, and I didn't sort of give a full explanation, the original visioning workshop that we had in Auckland had a variety of different people. So we had, I think there was an entire group actually. It was interesting. So we had sort of indigenous knowledge holders, quite a lot from New Zealand, Maori community, and also from Latin America that came over. And it was interesting because we gave everyone the choice to choose their own group, sort of whether you wanted to sort of bring your perspective into one group, and they actually chose to sort of develop their own sort of scenario visioning process, which was the one on I need to remember which one it was. It was the closest to number 3 in the triangle. You know, so it actually did the development of the framework itself was actually based in this process that had these different perspectives together. And that's why we have the nature as culture. We have this particular component that is not about separating people from nature. And we sort of try and hold it within the triangle that also has a perspective of we also still need to get food from nature. For example, we have an instrumental relationship, and there are some perspectives that are very much about actually nature just needs to be by itself. And so what we've done with some of the with the local level narrative. So again, here I was presenting as a task force an illustration of what we can do at the global level, and global participation is impossible to do, right? And so what we need to do is galvanize as many cross levels. So whether it's really small community level or whether it's sort of regional, I've got a project at the moment that's trying to grasp this at the African continental level, so to get a variety of those different narratives into place. And the idea is not to throw the triangle at people, but it's to sort of go through whatever is the most appropriate exercise of thinking about the future, and then to map that onto the triangle. If, you know, sometimes you can present the triangle and ask people to really sort of push them to think not just in the nature gives us food, but what are some of the other relationships. But there's sort of instances where actually you just need to get people to tell their own stories using different kinds of approaches, potentially like the seeds approach, I think is quite appropriate for this, because people get to think of their own innovations or their own solutions that they think are really important to take into the future. And once you've built that up, you could then see how this does or doesn't map onto the Nature Futures framework, and then use the triangle as a way to make sure that some of those narratives are able to also influence that global discussion. So I don't think that it's often fair to be bringing a lot of different local communities into some of these bigger discussions, right? Because of power dynamics, I think that sometimes actually the best thing is to allow them to create their own narratives and to actually just have the power to do that, and then to make sure that we're able to sort of take that and really feed that in a very sort of strong sense into some of those other places. But then there are also instances when no, they, you know, everyone does need to be a part of the decision-making process. And that's why something like IPBES, where you have to go into a plenary that has 130 odd, I think, member states at the moment. You know, so there is a a global audience for them. And I'm really fascinated to see if and when we ever get this potentially approved by plenary, what it's going to look like, because it is about holding contestation, right? And about holding different ideas. And I think people, particularly nation states, can get really scared by plurality. But at least this is hopefully a framework that's maybe a little bit less threatening to them, but that can still be used in a way to address some of those power dynamics and to address some of the distortion in what narratives are represented. But again, I think one of the key realizations, especially for the modelers on the team, is that, you know, they were like, oh, wow, but we don't have any indicators that tell us what a nature's culture future looks like, right? You know, so even just that realization, I think, has been super important for the broader sort of scientific community to actually just sort of take a step back and realize the multiple gaps that they actually have in their own work, and to realize that they need to go away towards addressing some of those. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, go ahead, Anne.
I'm going to cue.
I think you're the only person in the queue, so go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Okay, well, I hadn't completely managed to articulate what I wanted to ask, but I will attempt something, because it strikes me that you've been able to really operationalize these different perspectives very well. And I was wondering how you're managing. I mean, there was a very good account about allowing people to develop their own stories too, as communities and groups and so on. But how far is the perhaps incommensurability with some of these different philosophical positions that this points towards? How far is that also an integral part of what you're doing, rather than an attempted synthesis, which seems to be coming out quite strongly and is, of course, more practical in some ways?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we've also got to take this in the context of how it's been developed, which is as a voluntary task force of an intergovernmental process. And so kind of our mandate, which is handed down to us from the plenary and the MEP, is to catalyze new scenarios. So not necessarily to develop them ourselves, but to be able to maybe develop some of the tools that are needed to address the gaps that were identified in the methodological assessment. So, you know, we went about doing this to, you know, we went through these engagement processes, developed the framework, and trying now to do some of the illustrative narratives, but even that has been quite contentious within the group, because they are one particular manifestation of many iterations. So with the ongoing values assessment, which is, I think, where a lot of the more philosophical underpinnings are really being grappled with, we've tried to make a better alignment with that. But there is not, as such, within the task force, a strong philosophical engagement about what this actually means. Though in the paper, I sort of really tried to emphasize the fact that this comes from sort of rich traditions and discussions that are existing, right? We didn't sort of pull this out of thin air. And within the biodiversity community, this sort of instrumental, intrinsic, relational kind of triangle, I think, is pretty well articulated, but it still doesn't really have that practical sense of, well, what does this actually mean? And I think that's where using the future or futures thinking to be able to try and concretize that for people is an important step. But again, this idea of catalyzing or catalysis is that we really do, you know, we can't do all of the work ourselves. We really are trying to get the community of, whether it's biodiversity, conservation, sort of traditional ecological knowledge holders, futures specialists, to really work with us to provide as much sort of meat on the bones, whether it's local level case studies where they're saying, actually, this was a useless framework and no one understood what we were talking about, through to how we managed to get this really interesting story. Can you sort of also work it into your broader framework, and to unpack some of those deeper questions around it? Because we are limited in our capacity to do that. You know, this isn't a funded research project, unfortunately. It would be great to have one. And I'm now working well with Joost on the board on this African Futures project, which is going to try and do a little bit of that and to bring in some of the stronger, that I'm really interested in the decolonial narrative and to see how that could fit into this. So I think I like to think of the framework as flexible enough to be able to be open to this kind of engagement from a variety of different people. And that's really what we're trying to do as a task force. So I hope that vaguely answered the comment question.
Yeah, thank you. And I was really, I mean, I'm really struck by the fact that it is so useful for spotting gaps. And I really liked it. I was just kind of struck by the fact that it kind of points towards action, but it also points towards values and beliefs in the other direction. So, and then once you start to make stories out of it, you're back in the values and beliefs space again, as well as the action. So it has a sort of way where the two can't be separated, because inevitably in enacting the stories, you're contributing those kinds, so you're sort of filling that in a little bit. So I think it's just hugely interesting artifacts to be thinking with. So thank you. No, I'm very appreciative. I was just intrigued about how those transitions between states are managed, because models, they're very different depending on what you do with them.
And I think that's where some of those tools, so what we're also trying to do is talk about, so these are illustrative narratives, but we're trying to also talk about narrative families, where within, we won't just have one story, but a variety of different stories happening within one component. The problem is that, this is now a year down the line and we haven't even written up the illustrative narratives yet. So these things take so much time, as everyone within the space sort of knows and realizes. But which is why I'm also excited by different kinds of tools like Twine, where you can loop back and you can sort of go in a different direction. And so you can actually see that this isn't a singular linear pathway over there, that there are actually these decisions and other courses that we can make. And the biggest sort of question I have is really how we can hold on to that plurality when we're telling stories, because as soon as you tell the story, you do manifest a particular reality. But also, again, that big question I have around what does this extreme of desirable look like and what is outside the triangle, right? And that is a really interesting normative decision that maybe this is where the biophysical models can actually help us a little bit more, and just being like, no, this is untenable and is definitely outside, but this might be viable within. But informing those deeper value-laden questions, I think is going to be huge. But maybe that's what we need to start doing within the sustainability space, is having those questions. And maybe this is sort of the one contribution that the framework can also make. Thanks, Anne.
I'm really curious about the illustrative narratives as kind of knowledge objects. I'm really curious, do you expect, is it a way to show people how to use the triangle, or will those scenarios, do you think they'll go into policy spaces and get used? Or I wondered kind of what you expect them to do in the world.
Sure. So they are mainly supposed to be the format of this, an example of how you could use this, just because I think everyone was a little bit lost when you just give them the triangle. To give them the triangle with some stories and maybe some images is like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I think we're also going to have to do a lot, a good job at coming up with more, so that there's not just a single set, and that they are actually operationalized at different levels and scales. I think they're a little bit too extreme to be taken up in the policy space. We're talking really about asteroid mining and, people living completely off the land, or like living in these dynamic mobile sort of forces. So again, sort of this idea that I keep on harping on about, and it's in the paper, and I don't think I'm articulating it quite well yet, but this idea of extreme relativity is, I think, really what we're trying to capture here, is that there's a plurality of options within this extreme space that's kind of relative to each other. As you move away from one, you move towards something else. And I think that I'd like to think that we've done a really good job of coming up with what some of these outer extremes could look like in the space. Taking ecology to still be within a sustainability idea that's or for me is plausible, but maybe we could talk about that's not impossible. But yeah, there could be a more extreme version of it that still sits within the triangle, and I'd like people to play around with that. The other main sort of point of it is to get some of these debates around transformative interventions like actually captured somewhere in a space, because we have a lot of discussions around post-growth and around half Earth, and they these are backed by publications and by sort of legitimate knowledge. But they very much differ in how we think the future should look like. And I think we need a space to be able to at least put these stories down so that we're able to unpack what those implications are and the how to get there. There were some really interesting discussions when we started discussing the pathways around equity on like, okay, how do you get to an ecology? You are going to have to kick people off the land, right? Like that is going to be a big part of the pathway of getting towards this future. So if this is what you're aiming for, you need to realize that these are the steps that you need to take. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I see their use. But again, once you throw these things out there, particularly with some of we're sitting as an intergovernmental sort of panel, they could be taken in many different directions. So I think with a bit of caution too. But yeah, that's sort of the main aim I see.
Joost, I see you have a, sorry.
Okay, I'll go. I don't know. I can't see any artificially raised hands. I need to update my Zoom, I think. Laura, I was wondering, because I can imagine that the nature as culture perspective connects very well to a multi-species perspective, for instance. Do you find that you are able to connect to different communities of interest depending on these different combinations of nature, future, futures, let's say? That the nature as culture connects to a certain type of multi-species thinking, and maybe nature as nature is the rewilding. So you're connecting to entirely different sort of interest groups as well, right? Through these different futures, or at least potentially. I don't know if that's already happening. You have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, completely. So that's exactly the point. And also sort of where we're in the paper trying to map where some of these discussions could be happening, right, within the triangle, because yeah, sort of the nature as culture component, as well as the nature for nature. I think multi-species, sort of more than human, actually fits somewhere interestingly along that gradient, depending on how you actually interpret it, right? Traditional ecological, like a lot of indigenous and traditional ways of being and seeing the world, I think fit quite well within that corner. But again, it's about self-determining where you actually see yourself within the triangle. But I do think if people appreciate it as not a locking in, but actually an opening up framework where you can try and find your place, and that hopefully your place can be identified within this, then I really do see it as a way to engage multiple different groups. And, rewilding is already part of a lot of people on the task force interested in that. So I think that is one of the narratives. I think it's been a little bit more difficult considering the kinds of, we're all academics, number one, but the type of research that finds themselves in an IPBES like sort of situation is a lot more hardcore modelers, those of us who sort of are generally confused, and some more political scientists, but we're really trying to get sort of diverse economics perspectives. And there is an Indigenous and local knowledge task force that we're trying to bring on board to try and sort of make sure that the translation or the communication of the framework does actually make sense and is applicable to sort of a diverse set of groups and ways of seeing things. But yeah, the aim is really to be able to map as many of these on, or to get people to map themselves rather, not to sort of do it ourselves. And hopefully it is appropriate and to get feedback that way. And yeah, I was the client for the student projects for those really cool games, which I was really excited just in terms of communication. Like I was really struck by how well the game designers and students like actually got the triangle, considering it's something we've been working on for years, and that I'm convinced some of the task force members don't really get themselves, but they really jumped on it. And So I feel like it is actually quite a useful heuristic or sort of boundary object or bridging device to sort of bring a variety of different perspectives on board. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the choice of nature as a kind of way of framing the environment. And I'm thinking about kind of feminist perspectives that would sort of say, well, it's all nature cultures anyway. And yeah, how is, I'm kind of imagining that the triangle is so simple and tidy, but behind that is like a lot of discussion in the group. But I wondered if nature is kind of a way to capture as an object the natural world, whether everybody kind of agreed with that or whether there was some critique about that as an object.
Yeah, I mean, the framework itself was developed at a workshop in PBL with a lot of modelers and some scenario specialists. So it really wasn't critiqued in any way. I think, you know what, we've got to sit within IPBES as Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and this whole idea of nature's contributions to people. So the IPBES conceptual framework does have nature understood in multiple ways, whether it's as Pachamama, Gaia, etc. Is incorporated in the IPBES conceptual framework. And so the main rationale for us was to put that at the center rather than have an anthropogenic kind of center of well-being, for example. And I think that, again, so, you know, language is always a problem when we're using English, right? And so there are going to be different interpretations of that. You know, it was an environment. It was kind of this whole idea of where humans could also very much be a part of it. The nature's culture is like, I think, takes on that sort of feminist ecological perspective of, yeah, of what we're not even separate, right? That's what we're trying to get to within that corner. It's like, why are you even dividing us, right? And so hopefully it is a simple enough heuristic that if people aren't too picky about some of that language, that they can feel free to interpret it as openly as they're comfortable with or as they need, they can find themselves within the triangle, and can feel more comfortable in a particular perspective compared to others. But, you know, and it's again, you know, how else do you hold plurality, right? And these different perspectives, because as soon as you start to come up with different, you know, there's different terms, and we've got some triangles which actually try and articulate all of the different things that we mean by the corners. And, you know, as soon as you start writing things down, it, you know, it ends up being exhaustive. You're definitely leaving some things out by doing that. So yeah, I'm open to any suggestions on how we could address that, but it hasn't been a big question that's come up actually as when we've used it as a heuristic.
I think it's really fascinating because you're sort of starting with where people are, and then you're also kind of trying to transform them, and maybe by 2050 the triangle will be pretty different.
Yeah. So I mean, we do start when we do these participatory exercises, you know, quite often I'll say, okay, think of a relationship that you have with nature, right? A good one. And, you know, some people will think about the coffee I have in the morning. Some people will think about the lake by my grandmother's house. Other people will think about that time that I was, you know, exploring whatever. And then you're like, okay, that's just one instance in one time, but where does it fit within the triangle? So you can actually map it onto people's real experiences, recognizing that if they chosen another example, it would have sat somewhere else on the triangle, and that's totally fine. Yeah. Lisette?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for your presentation, Laura. I was just wondering about to hear a bit more about the modelers' responses to the framework. So is it really something that they reconsider how they should build their models? Is it something they adjust their models to? Is it something they see separate from modeling because it has so many different conceptions of nature?
I mean, so the reason that the paper in People and Nature took about 4 years of my life was that actually it's more modelers on that paper than anyone else. So to get buy-in and to get that understanding really was mainly a journey of bringing modelers on board into this way of thinking. It was not sort of trying to bring critical social scientists into the space, because they were never going to understand it. It's too simple a heuristic for critical social. They're like, but what about this? I'm like, but that can sit in that corner. But what about that? I'm like, okay, it's the modelers that we're really trying to bring on board with this, because the quantification is so powerful, particularly within the biodiversity and ecosystem services world. And so to get them to recognize the gaps that actually they aren't able to capture everything, and to just be like, at least to acknowledge it, even if they're not changing their models, I think was a really big and important step in the development of the framework. And so, yeah, they're on board. Everyone from PBL, IASA, like a variety of different groups. And we actually had a modelers workshop in January this year. We were sort of trying to bring people further on board. So I think that it has been quite useful for that. The problem is that there's a big lag time in actually being able to address models themselves, specifically IAMs, as you know, right? They're really clunky. We're not about to develop a whole new one, but there's definitely work to try and get them to operationalize it. Even just think about different indicators that they could be using, or the fact that they need proxies for some of these things has been an important step.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's also kind of limiting the kind of things you can imagine within this framework, because all the modelers were on board.
I don't know. I think we were pretty good at being as open as we can. I don't know, I'm not a modeler, and I think that it's pretty inclusive. And most of the people, as soon as you put it into practice, realize that actually it can do most of the things that you want it to do. So when I was talking about chatting to critical social scientists, it's more about that we use different words for things, but you can actually still capture it within the heuristic because of this underlying idea of plurality. So I really don't think it is actually limiting. I mean, if you look at some of these illustrative narratives, we had science fiction prototyping as components of that, which I think is pretty radical from a modeling perspective, and yet they understood the importance of that. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it was limiting. I just think that it was a long process, but once we came up with the triangle and it was in a language that modelers could understand, that's another reason we had the nature for society, nature for nature, nature as culture. It's like, okay, we don't really get what you sort of mean by this nature as culture, but like I understand it as something different from that, and I can give you a lot of examples of what it means. They're like, oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we don't have indicators for that. So it's an engagement, no? And I think that it did work in that without actually compromising its ability to sort of do its work. I'd like to think.
Cool, that's interesting. Thanks.
No.
Yeah, I think we are kind of running out of time, unfortunately. Seems that
No,
the hour is over. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you really a lot, Laura, for sharing all this. I think it will take some time for many of us to digest. I'm still processing. It's
for sure.
But
and please feel free to get in touch if you want more information or you're interested in like working with this. Yeah, as I said, we're trying to galvanize the community. So any engagement, any and all engagement is really welcome and appreciated.
Yeah, I think many creatures will be very, very glad to speak a little bit more with you.
Thanks, Laura. That was awesome.
Thanks, guys. Good to see some friendly faces behind.
Thanks a lot. That was interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. Cool to see you guys on some of the other exciting things happening this afternoon. Ciao, ciao.